Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen. We now have our presenters in conference. It is now my pleasure to turn the conference over to Ms. Jen Braun.
Thanks, David, and hello, everyone. Welcome to our monthly TeamSTEPPS webinar series on teams, TeamSTEPPS, and team structures, models for functional collaboration. My name is Jen Braun, and I'm with the Health Research and Educational Trust of the American Hospital Association. So we manage the national implementation of TeamSTEPPS, which is funded through AHRQ. So a big thanks to them for helping us put on these webinars and to fund this work. So before we begin, I just wanted to go over a few ground rules here. So you can access audio in two ways. The first way is through your phone, and that number, if you need a reminder, is in the notes section on the upper right. So if you dial in, please remember to mute your computer speakers so you don't have double sound. If you don't want to dial in through your phone, you can listen through your computer speakers. As you listen to this webinar, if you have a question, please feel free to chat it in via the general chat box on the lower right part of your screen. At the end, I'll gather the questions and we'll do a moderated Q&A with our speaker, Bill. If you have questions that are on the more logistical side, my colleague Abby is here and will respond to you right away. Just another few general announcements. This webinar is being recorded, so if you have a colleague that was unable to attend or if you wish to revisit this, you will be notified when the webinar recording will be posted, probably in the next 7 to 10 days. And then additionally, we will be sending out an evaluation at the end of this webinar, so we greatly value your feedback, so that will be sent to your email if you would not mind filling that out for us. Just a few upcoming events. Similar to this webinar, all of our educational offerings are free. We offer master training courses, which are open now through this June. And then registration for the later summer courses will open March 15th. If you actually click on the web links box on the lower part of your screen, you can click on any of those links and go directly there. In addition, we have our national conference this year in Cleveland, which is June 14th and through the 16th. Registration is still open, but it's filling up quite quickly, so please go ahead and register today if you're interested in attending. We have a helpline, so if you ever have any questions or comments about TeamSTEPPS, please feel free to give us a call or email us there at that email. A lot of your registration information and confirmation emails come from this address, so feel free to directly reply to that. And now we'll get to the good stuff. So I would like to introduce to you today Bill Gordon, who is faculty with the Department of Interprofessional Healthcare Studies at Rosalind Franklin here in North Chicago, Illinois. We actually met Bill and got connected with Bill through the national conference last year as one of our speakers, and we'll be eager to have him speak again this June in Cleveland. But we're very excited and happy to have him here today. So I will toss it over to you, Bill.
All right, Jen, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Let me begin simply by doing the academic thing, which is to declare that I have no conflicts of interest in relationship to this presentation. I have some objectives for us to consider for our work today. The first is that we are going to analyze team structures by looking at organizational diagrams, a pretty simple way to think about teams. But what we want to do is hypothesize what it is that's going on with those structures that might or might not meet our needs. So we're going to throw in some words that you may have not have used conversationally recently. They're words that are in my lexicon a lot: hierarchy, heterarchy, and holacracy, and they all represent models of organizational strategies for teams. We're going to evaluate those very structures by utilizing the TeamSTEPPS domains of leadership, situation monitoring, mutual support, and communication. And then we are finally going to look at some possibilities of how we might use those in different and creative ways to, again, achieve the goals that we're seeking. So let's begin with a critical question, and that critical question is, what do we mean when we talk about teams, and what is the difference between a group and a team? And one of the ways that I imagine that distinction, and it seems to work particularly where we're near an urban center such as Chicago, is that if I'm standing on a street corner and I am waiting for a light to change so that I can safely cross the street, in downtown Chicago, I'm very likely to be joined by other people who also have the same intention. They want to cross the street, headed in the same direction that I am headed, and we're all standing there waiting for that walk light signal to change so that we know, at least theoretically, it's safe to step off the curb. We're all stimulated and motivated by the same signal. We all seem to have the same sort of goal. And so the question becomes, is that a group or a team? In many ways, we sound like a team together. But the difference here is that we distinguish ourselves as a group because every person in the group is working out of his or her own interests. It's not likely that we're paying any kind of attention to whether other people actually cross the street when that light changes. We're not really interested in their goals, nor are they particularly interested in ours. In other words, we're functioning independently of one another. When I think about teams, I have to have one other piece here, and I want to clarify really quickly for you that the distinctions between teams and groups are not necessarily cut and dried. We can sometimes see more team-like behavior and other times more group-like practices. But the distinction that stands out for me with a team is that we think of teams as being people who do share a unified goal and to some degree at least perhaps even a unified fate. They are people who depend on one another in order to achieve the goal that they're seeking. Metaphorically speaking, and I tried to capture that in the graphic that you see on the screen, they're in the same boat. So it's sort of inevitable that if one person in that boat gets to where they want to go, everybody is going to get there as well. But if one person in that boat doesn't get to where they want to go, others are not going to get there either. So there's this real interdependence. They rely on one another in order to achieve the tasks that they're attempting to accomplish. TeamSTEPPS gives us a pretty good definition to work from, and I've highlighted these in colors because I like to visually break down the definition a little bit. So let's talk about each of these components. First of all, it takes two or more people. You can't have a team of one. And those people need to interact in some way, and I would posit that they're interacting in a way that is intentional rather than accidental. But the interactions that they exhibit are dynamic, that is, that they're always changing, always moving, that they are indeed interdependent, which we've already called out, and that they are adaptive, that is, that there's some fluidic quality to how these team members relate to one another. Where deficits occur, for example, someone presses in to fill a void. Team members share a common and valued goal, and that goal is the codifying reality for them. They cohere around that goal. They form themselves around that goal. It resets them so that they are all headed in the same direction, in the right direction, and they all know where they're going. Each member of the team has a specific role or function, and again, there's some intentionality to that. It's a bit like putting pieces of a jigsaw together, that each piece has a definitive shape, and the only way that the team works is when we figure out how to take one definitive shape and interlock it correctly with an adjoining definitive shape. So people are working with boundaries. They're working together around things that define them, such as perhaps license or title or a set of skills. And lastly, the definition reminds us that there is a time limit, and that is that every team is going to change. Nobody remains on the same single team indefinitely. Every time the team changes its constituency due to the passage of time, we see that there are needs for the team to rethink itself, renegotiate any agreements that it might have reached previously. What is most curious to me about this definition is that it is largely about how team members interact with one another and makes very little comment about who is on the team. Now, at Rosalind Franklin University, we have a special focus on interprofessional practice, which means that the teams on which our students are training are from various disciplines across our university, not out of a single isolated program. That throws some wild cards, if you will, into our hands as each program trains with a particular emphasis. And it becomes a very important skill, which we're going to tag a little bit later, to learn how to adapt and to work with people who are not like you. So TeamSTEPPS will work with a uniprofessional team, but it will also work with a team that is multi-professional, intersectoral, integrated, multidisciplinary, people who do not share a common background. What we're going to spend some time looking at is the impact of team structures on how those teams might behave. And I identified earlier the two frameworks that we're going to be utilizing. I want to look at the skill sets from TeamSTEPPS, but I also want to be thinking about these teams in terms of how they are formed and how that might affect relationships among team members, how communication flows in, through, and around the team, and then a very important topic, which is personal accountability. How much do I own my part of being in the team? So as I said earlier, we're going to work with some simple diagrams. And here's a very simple one indeed. It's a fairly common structure. So I would invite you to imagine that you've been invited to serve on a committee. And imagine what that first meeting is often like, where people come into the room and perhaps introduce themselves to one another if they haven't worked together before, but they wait for someone to come in and help shape and form what it is that that team is going to be doing together. When we put people together for a common purpose, we frequently get a diagram similar to what you see here in terms of how people relate to one another. Someone is identified as being in charge, and the primary relationships of the members of that organization tend to be with that person. Now, there are two things to note here. One of them is that I've only talked about individuals, but this diagram could also talk about systems. So we could be talking about a larger organization, a leadership team, for example, in the node or circle that you see at the top of the diagram, and then other departments or programs or other factors of your organization that might be represented by the lower 5 circles that you see here. There are other variations of this diagram, so this is not a definitive diagram. There are other ways that this might form itself. For example, if the person who is in charge, that person at the top, is leading from a place of compliance, that is the attitude of do it my way or hit the highway, the results might be very different than if it were being led by a person who was coming from a place of invitation, personal development, willingness to hear or listen to what team members had to say. So we could redraw this diagram depending on those circumstances. We might have double-headed arrows instead of single-headed arrows. We might have some indication, maybe it's lines or arrows that connect those lower tier team members to one another, so some sort of lateral communication. This diagram that we're looking at, however, will illustrate the points that I want to make about this format for organizing. Particularly, please pay attention to the fact that if this is the diagram that we're working with, if this is how your team is formed, by its very nature, it's entirely possible that what you've done is create silos. That is, where people don't talk to one another across either needs or purposes. They don't share information. They work in relative isolation. So, just to recap that, if we were to have a different leadership style at the top, we might have a very different organization represented. But let's look at this organization as we might more typically see it. although we're only seeing it with 5 or 6 members here, what we frequently encounter is that the organization is much larger, and in fact, much larger than this. But this will serve to illustrate the point. I've identified where you are in the organization. You're on the edge. You're identified by the arrow on the left-hand side. Notice how the layers exist between you and the person at the top, which would be that circle in the very center at the top of the page. How many layers of people tell us how many people we have to effectively communicate with to get a message from the top to where you are. And that person at the top has the responsibility and the authority for the organization, and quite possibly is making the significant decisions for it. Many times there are some very clear rules that are established about who can talk to whom in this organization. So I'm taught not to go over my boss's head perhaps, or if I go over my boss's head, maybe not to go more than 2. Likely I don't leap out of line and go running to the person at the top of the organization, that person in corporate America that we would refer to as being in the C-suite or the CEO. But in your department or in the area in which you work, it may not be a person who's even at the top of the entire organization. The structure tells us, though, that there is limited mobility vertically going up and down in this organization. So I want you to imagine that this person who has responsibility for what's going on is trying to send a very important message to all members of the organization, including you way out on the edge where you are. So the person in charge goes to their direct reports and passes on a message. And the direct reports, mind you, are very, very good people. They have very good intentions. They're very skilled at what they do. So we're not fault-finding with these people at all. They hear the message, and like all human beings, they begin to process what that message means. And in so doing, they may, in fact, change the message either in how they present it in terms of language or in how they present it in terms of priority. They may think that the people that they're talking to will understand the message better if they put it in a particular context or a particular way. So our person at the top has sent a message. The next person in line has heard the message but probably does not pass it on verbatim. They have an unintentional spin, if you will, that they use as they go to the third person in line. Now, I'm not going to walk us all the way through this, but as you look at this roadmap to how this message is going to get to you, it's entirely possible that by the time the message gets to you, if in fact it gets to you at all, it may sound and mean something very, very different than what was originally intended. And the best example I can give you of this is if you've ever played that child's game of telephone or telegraph at a birthday party where you whisper a message in one child's ear and they pass it on to the next child and so forth and so on. The humor in that game is how much that message has changed on the far end. Unfortunately, that isn't as humorous when we begin to talk about critical information in an organization. In the end, you don't hear the message that was intended, but you hear something that could potentially be substantially different, and that could be a problem if the message were particularly important. Let's turn this issue on its head a little bit. Let's imagine that you, being where the rubber hits the road in your organization, have a great idea. Something that if the people at the top knew, they would change the direction of the organization. And so you start the message where you are, and you tell it to your boss. And again, you've got a terrific boss. You've got, as I do, by the way, you have a terrific boss who wants to do the right thing and is very skilled at what he or she does. And so your boss takes your message and they convey it to their boss. But the same sort of thing happens. They use their own language. They put their own understanding of emphasis and meaning to it, as we all do. And that message gets passed on to your boss's boss, and it goes on up the organization from there. The message that you send may or may not reach the top in the form that you would recognize. So in other words, your message might make it all the way up to the top and nobody would recognize that it was yours, or it might change so much en route that it would feel like it was just lost in the middle of the organization. You're tenacious, however. You know this is a great idea, and so while you wait for results, you wonder what happened, but the results never come, and so you start again. You tell your boss again, and the exact same thing unfolds. That again, good people with good intentions pass the message on in the best way that they know how, but just because of the complexity of getting that message from where you are to the person at the top, it's entirely likely the message either doesn't arrive or is not recognizable when it does. So how many times do you do that before you begin to feel like nobody listens? Nobody cares what you think. Maybe you feel disenfranchised. Maybe you feel insignificant. Not because anybody's trying to make that happen, but it's not hard to imagine that when people are on the edge of an organization and this phenomenon occurs, that they end up saying, nobody listens to me anyway, nobody cares about me. Now there's a third challenge here in this structure as well, and that comes around the question of personal accountability. You see, in this organization, as long as I do what the person above me has told me to do, I can always point to that person when questions of accountability come around. And I can say, I did exactly as you told me to do. So you're to blame, not me. But let's go back to that person at the top. The person at the top has an awful lot of responsibility because ultimately, using the model I was just talking about, the buck stops there. And in fact, in some organizations, if things aren't going well inside the company or the hospital or wherever it is that we're talking about, it's often that stakeholders will say, well, the problem is the person at the top. And so they will replace that CEO or that president, that person who has responsibility or authority, and they'll bring somebody new in. And they'll plug that person into that position. And they expect that person to be able to fix whatever they felt was wrong. And so that person comes in with their agenda. Maybe they cast a new vision for the company, the new and improved version of your organization. And what that leader does is that leader takes on the role of hero. They're an heroic leader. They are expected, donning, I guess, their red cape, they are expected to fix whatever's wrong with what's going on. Now, if they're casting a vision for leadership, if they're casting a vision for the organization, that also means that when they leave, that vision may substantially change and throw the organization into a tailspin because it's not truly held by the members of the organization, but has been imposed on them by somebody at the top. So let's put a label and name to this model. I apologize, there we go, there's that heroic vision at the top. I missed my own slide. Here's that model. The model is hierarchy, and it's known for its hero or single node ascendant, that person who's in charge. It is most easily distinguished by that feature. So the hero promulgates that vision of how things are going to work, and they are given both the authority and the responsibility to implement that. Interestingly, this model then can become, in a very compliance-driven way, a power-over model rather than a power-shared model. And it can be that information becomes a source of power here, so even information or communication may not flow freely in that circumstance. Election to leadership in this case is not necessarily based on the ability to lead as much as it may be based on longevity or seniority, or because one is identified as an outside expert and you're brought in to fix whatever it is that's going on. Now, I don't want you to conclude that I'm saying that hierarchies are all bad, because they're not. They have some really wonderful strengths to them. And a couple of them that I would highlight for you are that they're very efficient for the transfer of information in small groups. Unfortunately, the larger the group gets, the more distorted the message can become as it gets passed through the layers of the organization. But hierarchies also help us to assure that people are in line to get that information. So there's a structure, sometimes considered a rigid structure, that tells us how that information is going to be passed along. So that can be a positive as well. We know everybody got some variation of the information that we were passing on. One of the other things that is true about hierarchies that we like is that they're familiar to us. In fact, it seems in our culture to be pretty much the default way that we put things together. My car runs on a hierarchy. It's a mechanical hierarchy. When I push the button on my dashboard that tells my car to run, a message gets sent to all the really important systems that make cars run, and my car starts and down the road I go. There are similarly, however, some liabilities with hierarchies. One of them we've already identified is that communication can be a problem. The result is often that in the face of poor communication, people at the edges begin to feel cut out or disenfranchised. The people at the top aren't getting what they want. People at the edges aren't getting what they want. And so frequently there's mistrust or distrust that's sown with that. And people at the edges sometimes conclude that it doesn't matter what I do, they're going to do what they want to anyway. We see that particularly one more time in high compliance organizations where there can be a lot of finger pointing to escape responsibility for actions and outcomes. But we continue to use them, and that's because they're successful. And there are some places where we know they work really well. Public safety, which would be fire departments and police departments, often are built around this sort of structure. The military, built around this sort of structure. Teaching and education. When I stand up in front of a classroom to teach, we are exhibiting this model of hierarchy with one person passing on information, unfortunately too many times in a one-directional way, to those who are receiving information on the other end. And then in emergency situations where somebody needs to step forward, to step up and guide us out of a dangerous situation. So I want to be clear with you, hierarchies in and of themselves aren't bad. The leadership in them, however, can directly influence and perhaps even change how they are utilized and how well they function for our purposes. Within TeamSTEPPS, we have 4 skill domains in the center of the shared model that we all use, and I want to talk about hierarchies in terms of that. So first, let's talk about leadership. Potentially less or non-collaborative leaders may not foster a relational model, that is, where people are developing relationships of trust, and that can affect the other areas. So situation monitoring can be very, very difficult if relationships are not fostered to be supportive and caring, and where people don't really have a big picture but rather are held in silos. Mutual support would then be impacted by that. Depending on the leadership, lateral access or communication across from one program or department to another may be very difficult. And lastly, communication itself, compromised by the filtering aspects of passing information through the layers of the organization. So from those skill sets, we can see that hierarchy and this model may not be our best match. But then let's look at what our alternatives might be. So here's a second example. In this one, I need for you to do some imagining. If I were to draw this correctly, I would need to connect each and every dot with every other dot that you see here. And the arrows would be two-headed to indicate that there was free communication going from one place to another and back again. And if I were to have drawn that out for you, that would have been a very difficult graphic, both to see and to understand. So I'm just suggesting to you what it might be like, and I would like you literally to fill in the blanks. So what would this organization be like? Well, one of the distinctions that we know from hierarchy is that relationships are no longer defined by rigid or linear structures. I can go to anybody and talk to anybody anytime I want to. Communication doesn't follow a prescribed pattern. I don't have to live with the interpretations of what other people tell me somebody said. I can go to that person myself. And I no longer have someone to point to and say, I did what I was told to do by the person above me with more responsibility and authority, I have to begin to take some responsibility for myself. So in this case, that shared common goal that we found in the TeamSTEPPS definition becomes really critical. It becomes the container, if you will, in which this entire team has been held. Rather than just one person holding on to those goals or that vision, it is now known and held by everybody else. It becomes the way, the boundary against which we can push to measure everything else. If you will, it can be the North Star against which all of our directions are calibrated. Everything becomes located and defined by its relationship to this common valued idea. This model is called a heterarchy, and it is characterized by this sort of hive-like activity that goes on inside of heterarchies. That is, everyone works and pulls together, and you may in fact have been in a heterarchy if you have been on a high-functioning team, either in your current job or where you have worked previously. Now in this case, power moves around the organization based on who's best suited to lead us during a particular moment or situation. In a medical suite, for example, the housekeeping staff knows more about cleaning the space than does anybody else, the physician, the physical therapist, whomever. For that task, everyone gets out of their way and allows them to do their work. They lead through that portion. But they step back when a task shows up that someone else is better suited to do. It might be the transporter who's bringing that person in or out of the room. It might be a nurse anesthetist who's going to put that patient to sleep or wake them up. In this model, nobody is taking work away from anybody else, but the shared vision allows us fluidly to step back when we're not best suited for the job and to step forward when we are. So in this organization, we see information flowing non-symmetrically, not following that rigid structure. There is no formal chain of command identified by the graphic itself. Because it is a shared power structure, we tend to see less of that concern about what's going on with people on the edges, because everybody is able to participate in a fuller way. So these structures tend to be very adaptable. They tend to adapt themselves to what's happening around them. They tend to meet the needs of the task to which they're assigned. They're pretty transparent. It's pretty easy to tell what's going on because communication is shared among all people and trust can be generated as a result of that. And once again, because the vision binds us together on this team, when there is a failure, team members tend to ask not who made the error, but rather what went wrong. What did we miss? How did we not catch that there was going to be a problem here? We all become responsible to monitor what is going on and to support the successes of one another on the way to our goal. There are still some liabilities here as well. This uncertainty, nobody is in charge, makes some of us very, very nervous. In fact, there is somebody in charge at all times. It's just not the same person. There are informal channels of communication. So in this organization, unlike hierarchy, it's not necessary for all information to flow across the entire organization, but again, it can be based on need. Sometimes I don't need to know something that's going on in another part of the organization, so long as we are all working toward that same common goal. Again, let's use the TeamSTEPPS model to look at the features of this. In this case, our leadership would tend to be more fluid because it's being shared. That is, that it's based on information rather than titles or seniority. Our team members would need to be paying attention to the big picture. They need to be looking at what's going on in order to protect not just their individual successes, but the successes of the team. That is made more nearly possible because there is more open communication. And team members can support one another more easily because there is the opportunity to know when someone has a need. Communication and relationship aren't defined by placement within the organization, and power does not necessarily rest in titles here. Hopefully then, the differences between the heterarchy and what we saw earlier in the hierarchy become rapidly apparent. But wait, there's more, as the old saying goes. Here's our third example. This third example, again, requires your imagination because every one of these little dots is connected to every other little dot, and that's one of the factors that we have to consider here. But there's an important second factor as well, and that is that these dots are mobile. That is, that people can move from one part of the organization to another freely as they are needed. So they gain a different perspective on the whole organization rather than being contained in only one department or one venue. The organization then begins to develop a really strong sense of community. One corporate organization that's currently using this model produces a yearbook every year and asks their employees to talk about their experience. And it's a really interesting read because the way employees talk about their job is not in the usual, this is my job, I check in and I work 9 to 5 or whatever. Rather, they talk about it in terms of reference that are not generally used by employees. They talk about the community where they work. And they talk about their fellow employees as their friends, rather than talking about them as their co-workers. Well, you can imagine if all of this activity is going on, that communication is very different here as well. It is, to some degree, remarkably informal. Anyone can talk with anyone else. Information doesn't necessarily need to go across the entire organization. But personal accountability here must be really high, and that's where this gets interesting. Originally, there was a concern when the structure was proposed that people might be able to hide out, or what we refer to as being passengers just along for the ride. It is now appearing where this is being implemented that the cultural element of this structure elicits a really strong commitment to the team vision and team values. People recognize that they are creating the environment in which they want to work in very direct ways. And so they elect to make decisions that enhance that environment rather than taking advantage of it. So to use a way of thinking about it that we have used in the past two models, that common, shared, valued goal becomes absolutely critical here. It is the container for the entire organization. It is a vision that surrounds the entire community. This model is called a holacracy. And in this model, team members must be fully calibrated to what's going on. They must be fully calibrated to the stated vision, and they must make their decisions on that basis. And assignments are going to be made on that basis as well. It's going to be kind of a fluid organization where people may be moving around. There are other descriptors for this besides holacracy. They're sometimes called self-organizing, or there's a Greek term called autopoiesis, which is referencing a very organic model in which the components of the model define the model. That is, the people within the model define the entire organization rather than being defined by it. So there are three for us to consider. We know that in each of these, it's been very, very important for us to think about decisions and communication. In this very informal model, decision-making is given to individuals, so there's a lot of autonomy. And communication must be central to team functioning. We know that in this model there's a lot of fluidity. We know in this model that team members feel very valued for their ability to make contributions, and we know based on what they're telling us about the work experience, their lived experience inside the model, that there's a strong sense of connection. But like every other model, there are some things that are a little bit troublesome for us. The lack of hard rules and this organizational structure sort of emerging at this particular time may make it difficult to implement, where established roles and responsibilities are more rigid or clearly defined. It might not be a great model for a medical team, for example. Non-participation can happen, although, again, the more we can develop that sense of common purpose, our vision, our commonly held and valued goals, the less that's likely to happen. And then one of the things that we have discovered is in a very large version of this organization is it's very difficult to track when things are done. And so there needs to be some creativity about how that communication goes on as well. So here we are on the home stretch, looking at how leadership has to act in this kind of holacratic model. Because there's a lot of membership autonomy and empowerment, that means the leadership here can't be compliance-driven, but must change more to a facilitator model in which the leader is willing to let things emerge as they emerge without feeling the need to directly control what's going on. Situation monitoring becomes possible in a different way because people move from place to place within the organization and get a much bigger sense of what the organization is really all about. It is therefore possible for them to understand when other people need support, and because the model seems to be engendering positive relationships, people tend to lend themselves to one another for team success. And lastly, communication can be challenging in the sense of being certain that all who need to know are informed, but it can also be a challenge around what's happening inside the organization. So this would need to be a very, very reflective process. Here's the good news. You don't have to pick just one. This is not an either-or choice. But in fact, it's possible that we recognize that not all structures are created equally, that they require different skills, that they carry different expectations, and that they provide different results because of how they work. So rather than asking necessarily who's going to be in charge at that next committee we go to, maybe what we ought to be asking is what's our anticipated or needed outcome, and how do we put ourselves together in a way that's going to help that. What you're seeing here is a graphic that hybridizes this structure. So at the core of it is still a very traditional hierarchical model which by your bylaws or organizational structure may be required. But at the edges where there are task-specific teams and where there's the latitude to do so, we can see a different model also coming into play. And I can tell you that can be an infectious process because very often the hierarchical models, being that much better suited to the tasks that they are assigned to, are able to get the work done quickly, and others want to know how they did that. Here, leadership has to be committed to the efficacy and the efficiency of the teams. You have to trust the process a bit here. It means team members must be able to see the larger purpose and picture, so transparency is essential, and people need to be given the opportunity to find ways to support the success of everyone. While one certainly cannot advocate that this is a good choice for every team or organization, I think we can safely say that at the very least, one of the things we can identify is that there is a choice. We are not bound by the former ways of organizing ourselves. There are options. But it means we're going to have to learn to be on a team, perhaps in a different way than we've ever done before. That is, we have to become focused on team outcomes rather than individual successes. The team succeeds or fails together as a team. Remember, they're all in the same boat. One of the slides that I really like from the TeamSTEPPS PowerPoint deck is this one, and I've done a little bit of modifying to it, but it's pretty true to its original form. And that is to draw the distinction between what you would need to do if you're going to function out of that mentality that it's only me and only about me, versus what you will need if you're going to function on a team. And if you look carefully, you'll see that the skills aren't completely different from one another, but what we've added in the blue box to the right when we ask you to work on a team is we're asking you to add some particular skills. We have to train ourselves and our colleagues on things that are about the larger picture of who we are. And we have to reframe our relationships. We have to reframe leadership. We have to reframe communication. We have to rethink how we do personal accountability and how broadly we're willing to view the situation we're in so that we can assist others so that they succeed, knowing that when they succeed, we all have the potential to succeed. That's not an easy task. One-on-one communication is considerably easier than it is to try to change a system or to change a way of thinking. And one has to find a way to communicate effectively across that system to allay the fears of people who don't like change or who don't navigate change easily or well. But that daunting task should not be enough to hold us back. The other thing that we have to recognize is ultimately that not all leaders or leadership styles are successful with all of the types of organizational structure that we've been talking about. So a person who is used to being in charge in a compliance-driven model may not be suited for a collaborative team. My own personal leadership style tends to be much more on the collaborative end of the spectrum, so I'm not a person who's going to be a good leader in a team that is very compliance-driven, where people have to do something exactly as they're told. How we organize ourselves in teams impacts and perhaps even dictates how those teams can function. Rigid leaders with narrow expectations may not fare well with the latter two models that I showed you, the more adaptive and creative ones. But once again, the key issue here is to remember that we do have choices. We are not bound by the models that we have used traditionally. Here are a few references that I would point you to, things that I have found useful in putting this presentation and others together. I highly recommend them to you. I also want to tell you that I think that in making changes in teams and in thinking about the key skills that are identified in our shared model in TeamSTEPPS, I think it's really important that we find ways to work together around what's working and not working, around what we've tried or have not tried. And so I really do invite an elevated conversation about this topic, and I would love to be a part of that conversation wherever and however it happens. So I invite you, if you have questions or thoughts that you want to test out with someone, I'm open and willing to do that with you. I really do want to thank you for making time available today to be a part of this conversation at this level. I know how busy everybody's schedule seems to be, and I'm just really grateful for your time. So Jen, I'm happy to hand this back to you.
Thanks, Bill, and thanks for a really great presentation and perhaps a unique way to think about how teams are structured and perhaps how TeamSTEPPS is tied into that. One of the first questions we received from Maribel is, what would be your recommendation when implementing a hybrid model when the hierarchy model is predominant?
Well, I'm really glad this question came up. I have a little bit of experience with this with some consulting work I've done with a very, very large corporate organization in which I was asked to help develop hierarchical teams on the edge of a very large, substantially situated hierarchy. And here's what happened. We got teams at the edges to say this task would be better suited if we could all more equally or collegially step in and work together on this team rather than having to report to one person. And what happened was they very effectively and efficiently accomplished their task, and naturally a joining team said, how did you do that? How did you make that happen? And so what we started to see was the sprouting of these hierarchical task-based teams on the edges of this hierarchical organization. And I've been working with this group over the course of several years, and what is, I think, wonderfully amusing at this point is I'm now beginning to see vice presidents come to the training saying, what are you teaching? How is this working? Because they recognize that in some places in their organization, that's a preferred model over the one that has been the default. So I think it's getting a concentrated group of people together to say this is how we want to operate for this task, and trying it out, test driving it, and then reporting those results back out and say we went this direction, and see what sort of support you get.
And I think that's very true with TeamSTEPPS, is starting small, measuring, do PDSA processes and cycles. So I think that's great.
Yep.
So in the medical field, there are a lot of very structured protocols that have to be followed. So how do you have a team approach at the same time giving staff autonomy?
Well, a number of years ago, I had some surgery on my shoulder, and I was really impressed with the team that did that. It was a very hierarchical team. I had a very skilled surgeon. I had all the players that ought to have been in that surgical suite. But what I watched, and it was a leadership question more than anything else, I watched the physician allow the people to work at the top of their licenses, at the top of their skill sets. He managed the resources he had in the room extremely well and was wise enough to step back and say, I don't know, for example, how to put this guy to sleep and wake him up, as well as, in that case, a nurse anesthetist in the room did. And I think it's really a question about reframing our expectations both of leaders and of ourselves. Simply because we have these defined roles does not, and defined protocols, does not preclude us from letting people do those without feeling like someone is, watching over their shoulder. It's about changing that compliance model to a supportive mutual support model. And that too takes some time, and it takes some trust building, but it is possible.
Sure. And so a lot of what you presented today obviously ties in nicely to specifically the team structure module of TeamSTEPPS.
Right.
So have you tied any of this into the curriculum or any training you've done?
We've begun to teach TeamSTEPPS in small pieces. I found that we were teaching the full TeamSTEPPS in a 6-hour session, and I found that kind of daunting for people. They couldn't remember at the end what we had taught them at the beginning. So what we're doing is beginning to integrate, rather than teaching leadership in a silo and situation monitoring in a silo and mutual support in a silo and communication in a silo, we're beginning to integrate how we present those in small bites. And in fact, that's what I'm going to be talking about at the national conference this year, is how do you begin to do that? That was not a commercial, by the way. Shameless self-promotion. I'm sorry.
No, you have the platform. Go for it.
That's something that we are working on here. I've got some great colleagues that I work with here that are helping to put that in a clinical framework. I'm not a clinician myself. To put it in a clinical framework, we also here at Rosalind Franklin teach this to everybody. So non-clinical people like myself, all of our faculty, all of our staff, all of our students are being exposed to TeamSTEPPS, and we are looking for ways to do that in a more creative way, and cutting across those silos, even in the shared model, I think is one way to do that.
Right, and so in thinking of that module in TeamSTEPPS, and when they talk about the multi-team system for patient care, so
Yes.
it's kind of like a triangle with the patient and the core team and contingency and ancillary teams. How, based on what you just presented, what are your kind of considerations in what you just presented, and perhaps kind of tying some of these models into that, the multi-team system?
Well, I think the multi-team system points us to the fact, to a number of facts, a number of realities. One of them is that as a team member, you're likely to serve on multiple teams, and the patient is being exposed to multiple teams of people. And each of those, in that module, each of those teams is given some very specific tasks, some very specific things that they are responsible for. So within each of those teams in the multi-team system, it would be possible for us to rethink how we structure ourselves. But the key place here for me, and remember, the patient is intended to be at the center of what we're doing here. I think it becomes really helpful for patients as members of these multi-teams. It becomes really important for them to have some of that fluidity and the ability to work hierarchically, to reach across teams, to ask for help when they need help from some other place, to not be so structured that we say, that's not my job. You need to ask somebody else to do that, but rather to get focused on that common valued goal, which is ultimately outcomes, good outcomes for the patient. So I think we have to think about all the teams that are represented in that multi-team system, and I think ask ourselves, what's the best format for that kind of team, keeping in mind the common thread is the patient and the family.
Exactly. So when you are kind of teaching this or teaching the structures to students or to clinicians for that matter, do you have any recommendations for any in-class activities to practice some of what you've presented here today?
Well, actually, yes, and they come out of a lot of the TeamSTEPPS material. There's a paper chain exercise that we use, and the way that I teach it with many of our students is I let them go through that activity first, and then come back and say, okay, let's talk about how did you identify the leader? How did you experience this? And I think probably that's the global answer I would give you, is give them the experience first to reflect on, rather than giving them the sort of data about these different models. Give them a chance to experience them, to find out, how was my lived experience in this heterarchy different from my lived experience in a hierarchy, and let them begin to draw the line. So I don't do anything that's hugely extravagant. I look to pre-established activities, and instead of teaching before them, I tend to teach after them.
Yeah, and the paper chains is a great activity to do with minimal resources. So that's one of my favorites.
Yeah.
A great question came in is, are there generational groups, so millennials, baby boomers, et cetera, that prefer to work in one model over another?
It appears that way. One of the organizations that I was referencing that became a holacratic organization on the holacracy actually went to their employees before they made the transition and said, we're about to make a big change. Would you like to come with us? If you wouldn't, we would be happy to severance you out. And they offered a very handsome severance package. We'll be willing to severance you out. And what appears to have happened is that older workers, and I say that with respect because I'm in that category, older workers chose to stay with things that they knew. And so they tended to not come as quickly into this holacratic organization. Newer workers appreciated the fact that they didn't have to wait 30 years, for example, to get into a position where they could make decisions within the company, because there's so much autonomy to make decisions and to do the movement within the holacracy. So that's my only evidential base. I don't claim that as being definitive, but that was one of the observations coming out of a very big transition with a very big company.
Interesting. So I think we have time for one more question. So what advice would you have, or would you give a highly regulated environment where the senior leadership functions as a heterarchy while the rest of the organization is drawn to a hierarchy?
Well, from my personal experience, Jen, I'm going to say, lucky you. But that may not be what your experience is. I think when you have a hierarchy at the top, what you have is people who are willing to listen to new possibilities and new ideas, and are willing to look more broadly across the organization. And my experience has been, limited as it may be, my experience has been that when you have that kind of leadership, that you don't end up with the compliance-driven hierarchy in the model that I showed you. You get instead invitations for people in the hierarchical structure to give feedback to the leadership. That's a very different way of functioning in the hierarchy than what I talked about when I talked about it being strictly compliance-driven. In medicine or healthcare, period, there are a lot of rules. There are a lot of things people have to do. And in no way am I suggesting let's just let everybody do whatever they want and have a grand old time. I recognize that there are things, protocols, procedures, laws, regulations that exist for a reason. The pushback that I would offer to any organization is, are you certain that the way you've structured what you're doing is actually the best way to get the results that you're seeking?
Great. And thank you so much for presenting. This was a wonderful webinar. And just kind of a few notes to kind of close here. This was recorded, everyone, so we'll be notifying you when the recording is posted and available. The slides are on AHRQ's website, so if you go to ahrq.gov www.teamsteps.com/TeamSTEPPS, and then click on the webinars box. It will take you right there. And again, we just sent out the evaluation, so we greatly value your feedback. And again, Bill, thank you so much for presenting here today.
My pleasure. It's been a privilege.
Thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes today's presentation. You may disconnect your phone lines, log off your webinars, and thank you for joining us this afternoon.